and welcome to the Giving Voice to Depression podcast, brought to you by Recovery.com. Each week we profile a guest who shares intimate details of their mental health journey. They share because they understand that when people don't talk about their depression or other mental health conditions, those of us who struggle with them can feel like we're the only ones, that there's something wrong with us, instead of understanding that we have a common and treatable illness. I'm Terry, the creator and co-host of this podcast.
And I'm Dr. Anita Sands, a licensed clinical psychologist with more than 25 years in clinical practice. I know from both personal and professional experience how significantly mental health and other disorders can impact not just our lives, but those around us as well. By speaking openly and with the wisdom of lived experience, we help normalize conversations that are often avoided due to shame or stigma. Our episodes are honest and real, and we keep them hopeful because there truly is hope, despite what depression tells you.
This podcast is brought to you by Recovery.com, whose mission is to help each person find the best path to recovery through a comprehensive, helpful network of treatment providers for both mental health and addiction treatment worldwide. Hello, Anita.
Hi, Terry. If you look up the risk factors for depression on a site like Mayo Clinic's, for example, you'll find a list that includes certain personality traits, such as low self-esteem and being too dependent, blood relatives with a history of depression, bipolar disorder, alcoholism, or suicide, serious or chronic illness, and traumatic or stressful events.
And when our guests share about those events, their traumas, their stories are often told quietly, sometimes hesitantly, because big T traumas are really hard to talk about. They're messy, often intensely personal, and there can be fear of how they're going to be received when exposed.
But this is different. This week's guest tells her story with such vivid detail that it sounds like she's describing harrowing scenes from a movie that would make your heart pump fast while watching it. And maybe that's because it centers around a natural disaster, so there's less stigma, shame, or risk of retribution in sharing the details. But the impact is similar and long-term and requires hard work to get past. Please take this as a heads up that if you have lived through a natural disaster trauma, this episode could be a trigger for you. It may also be helpful, though, to know that you're not the only one who is surviving something like this. So please listen as Tara Pyfrom gives her voice to depression.
Tara's family is no stranger to hurricanes.
My wife and I were born and raised in the Bahamas, lived our entire lives there. Our families go back 8-9 generations. Island people are used to weathering storms. But we've never experienced a storm where we felt that we were in danger, where there was fear for our lives. We've only ever had minor damage from even some of the worst storms that have hit the Bahamas. So when Hurricane Dorian in 2019 kind of became a blip on the radar, okay, time to get ready again. We know where to put the patio furniture. We know to go fill up the gas tank. We know to get the food. We know all the things. It's just a checklist at this point.
Even as Hurricane Dorian grew to a level 5 status, the highest it gets, her family took comfort in the fact they were in a newer house with an elevated foundation. They felt ready. And
then Hurricane Dorian hit. And within a matter of hours, there was no ready. We had 185 mile per hour winds plus gusts. So we're talking over 200 mile per hour winds. So our living space, we estimated to be about 10 feet above sea level, above high tide mark. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the water was inside our house. It started out as an inch, and then it was 2 inches, and then it was ankle, and then it was knee. And then we were sloshing through the house thinking we were going to save photo albums. We're going to put them up on the high shelves. We'll be fine. But the water didn't stop, and it kept rising.
Tara, her wife, their 6-year-old daughter, and 5 dogs climbed onto their kitchen counters to stay dry.
Eventually, the water became high enough that the countertops were not dry anymore. There was no dry. And of course, a 6-year-old, she's terrified. We're trying to pretend like, oh, it's okay. Yeah, it sucks to be wet. No big deal. Meanwhile, my wife and I are both, completely freaking out and trying to have whispered conversations with our 6-year-old 5 feet away about, should we try to swim to our neighbor's house? Like, our neighbors are, a few hundred yards away. Should we try to swim? They have a second story. Maybe that's safer. Should we go outside? Should we climb on the roof? Should we tie ourselves to the top of our car? All of these very ridiculous ideas of what are we going to do if the water doesn't stop rising? And it didn't.
Tara says fear and clouded judgment took over as all the worst-case scenarios now seemed quite possible, if not likely. They decided to leave their house.
We actually swam out of a window onto our back porch, which was covered, but open, and kind of huddled with floating patio furniture and a cotton mattress as a raft, with extension cords tied around our waists to keep us all together. We were outside for a grand total of 30 minutes, the longest 30 minutes of my entire life. After the second time that my head went under and I inhaled water, we kind of made the decision that inside was better than outside.
Inside and as high up as they could possibly get.
Our attic space does not have any exterior access. There's no dormer windows. There's no way out. Once you're there, there's no other way out but the way you went in. So we had a small attic access that had a ladder, and we went up into the attic, got the dogs into the attic. When we took the last dog into the attic, I had to dive under a door frame to get the dog with me into the attic, to the stairs. That was in a closet area.
And there they sat, in total darkness and fear, just waiting.
Waiting for the water to get that high, waiting for the water to trap us there, waiting for the water to drown us in our attic, waiting for the roof to rip off at any minute, feeling the beams and the wooden bracing in the roof moving with the wind, terrified that there was going to be a tornado and would be even more wind, and then it would just pull us all into the abyss and we would all die. Thankfully, none of those what ifs, waiting for it to die for 24 hours, happened.
Tara says the ocean peaked at the 9-foot ceiling of their home, a structure that was already elevated another 10 feet for flood protection. By morning, they were able to gauge, by the only available measure, that the ocean was starting to recede.
We were counting the ladder steps. Right? So, wait, that ladder step, we couldn't see that before. That means the water's going down. Oh, now we can see 2 ladder steps. Now we can see 3. And that was the moment where it was like, okay, we survived. We're alive. It's starting to get safer now. The storm is leaving. We had to wait another 6 hours for the water to go down enough to get out of the attic.
Almost none of their possessions could be saved, but they were. Within minutes of coming down from the attic, and long before official rescue efforts began, they were picked up by a friend with a boat who knew they needed help.
We made it to a shelter point, and then from there we made it to acquaintances that were able to put us up until the storm was past, and about 48 hours later we were able to evacuate the island by plane. And I can't tell that story, and I haven't been able to tell that story in the 5 years since the storm without extreme anxiety, without my heart beating in my chest. When I am finished with you this afternoon, I will have a migraine. Every time I tell this story, every time I do a podcast, it's guaranteed.
I'm sorry.
But I still do it.
Yeah.
Voluntarily.
So you go through a trauma like that. And obviously this is a depression podcast. So how did that affect your mental health?
So PTSD almost right away. We evacuated the Bahamas. We went to Florida. We had a place to stay there. So we, were temporarily stable. But United States immigration is not terribly helpful for folks that are not U.S. citizens. So our time in the United States was limited. We were not prepared to go back to the war zone that was the Bahamas at the time. So with 3 weeks of planning, we threw our hands up and said, right, we're going to move to another country that we've never lived in before. All while PTSD, not sleeping well, excessive overwhelm, not really prioritizing mental health. We prioritized our daughter's mental health over ours. Like, we got her into therapy right away. And really, we'll get to us eventually once we're stable, once we have a place to live, once we, do all of these checklist things. But by the time we prioritized our mental health, depression and hopelessness, and I'm never going to feel any better than I am right now, had set in.
And how long was that the case for you?
It was a few years of, we both my wife and I spent time in therapy together and separately. I found talk therapy very helpful, but it was a very slow process. So I'm processing the PTSD. So there was a lot of, this is what life's going to look like now. I'm just going to spend the rest of my life with the pain and the trauma of Dorian being carried around with me like a, genetic disease. This is just my life now. The belief that I would always feel angry, that I would always be sad, that my wife would always be sad, that this was just going to be life now. And that was like that for a few years, a good three and a half years.
It's worth noting here that no matter how uniquely ours, our story and the challenges, traumas, and diagnoses we face are, they can all lead to that same hopeless, this is just my life now, belief. For Tara, two very specific things helped her shift from that stuck place.
One was that my therapist, as soon as she found out that I was an amateur writer, poet, we're going to use that to help you process. You're going to write it all down. And every time you write it down, you're going to read it to me, and you're going to read it to me again, and you're going to read it to me again. And it's going to be desensitization and processing emotions. And that was super helpful. And I got very, very focused into wanting to put it down on paper so that I could explain to my therapist exactly what had happened minute by minute.
The other big catalyst for healing actually emerged from conflict and deep self-reflection.
And so at one point I just sat down, I'm like, okay, I'm not happy. I have everything I'm supposed to have to be happy. What do I need? I don't know what I need. Okay, when was the last time you were happy? What did that look like? What did that feel like? What was bringing that happiness then that you don't have now? And that kind of started the conversation in my head about, okay, well, that's something I can get that. I can do that. And then maybe that's the key. Maybe that's the next goal.
Tara and her wife realized they needed to build a new home to replace the one they'd lost. A space that was uniquely theirs and uniquely them.
And so the process of focusing on that and focusing on the happiness that was going to bring us was really, for me, what kind of pulled me out of that hopelessness. Like, this is a goal. This is a step-by-step process. And seeing what we had created together was the happiness, that kick that I needed.
Tara says while their trauma has hardly evaporated, finding and using tools, both literal and metaphorical in their case, has made a huge difference.
When we're in the middle of trauma and process and depression, time stops because everything just feels hopeless. And tomorrow's not going to be any better, and the day after that's not going to be any better because the last 3 days and the last 3 weeks weren't any better. And so looking forward, doesn't feel like I'm getting anywhere. I feel like I'm stuck, standstill. But then when you look back at the amount of time that you've processed and where you were 3 weeks ago and where you were 3 months ago, well, yeah, I am a little bit better. And so time's a funny thing, and time has been a funny thing for me over the last 5 years. But really, it's really been about take the time to do the things that will help you get better, and maybe focusing on the future, but also really looking at where you've come from the past.
When we're in it, we think we'll never get out. So how did you keep, like, if I do this, if I keep taking these steps forward, if I continue with therapy, if I write, if I build, I will get somewhere better. Where'd you pull that from when I know that depression's saying, throw your hands up, it's over. You're stuck, it's over, you know?
But for me, what I could control was, what am I going to do today? What am I going to do tomorrow? These are the steps. And just this belief that there has to be something better. This can't be it. There has to be something better. And if I just keep doing today and tomorrow and the next day, I'm going to get there. I don't know when I'm going to get there. There were lots of times where I thought that next step that I was moving towards was going to be the step. That's going to be the one that's going to make me feel better. That's going to be the one that's going to make me feel stable and less hopeless and more excited about life. And so I kind of tricked myself into believing that every step was the next step. And then I get there and it wasn't the step. Okay, well, what am I going to do now? Okay, the next step is going to be this step. And so it was just keep moving forward.
Do you consider yourself happy now?
I do. I do.
Glad.
I can't say that there aren't days when the darkness kind of tries to creep in again. If I, try and sit too deeply in some of the emotions that are still there, it's not good for me. And I know it isn't. And I try to avoid sitting too deeply with it too much. But yes, I can, 5 years later, I'm back to happy. I'm different than I was before the storm. But happy.
Terry, this was such an intense episode listening to Tara. I have a lot of respect for survivors of natural disasters. I've worked with many Hurricane Andrew survivors here in Florida, clients who still have a resurgence of their PTSD symptoms and depression when hurricanes look like they're bearing down on the state. Mm-hmm. And I myself in 2004, as sort of a new resident to Florida, went through 4 hurricanes in 1 year. Really not anything that was anywhere close to the devastation that Tara talked about. But it was my first time, and I had a 4-year-old daughter, and I was very, very afraid. And to this day, if I go through one of those automatic car washes, when those big blowers at the end, those huge airplane engine fans that blow off and dry your car, those still will make my heart race, because that sound of howling wind is something that I experienced for 12, 18 hours on end, and it being my first time and not realizing, what could or would happen, it is extremely frightening. What Tara and her family went through would absolutely have caused the level of symptoms that she talked about with the PTSD.
Mm-hmm. And Tara tells her story in spite of the fact that she says it gives her a migraine to do so, because A, she wants some good to come from her family's trauma, and B, she really wants people to understand that even from terrifying events, it is possible to find the strength, to find ways out. And she is an example of that out involving and including true happiness.
Mm-hmm. And it was also something that reminded me of the episode we did a little while back, where there was that poetry quote that you have to move the pain that's inside of you out of your body.
Yes.
And she embodied that when she was working with her therapist in terms of her writing and poetry. But art and dance and movement and singing and creating, and what Tara also did, building, moving the pain out of your body so that it doesn't just live there, is so powerful, is so therapeutic. And so many of the recommendations for how to successfully treat PTSD now do involve movement, the emphasis on moving your body in safe ways, moving that trauma outside of yourself in safe ways.
Well, she moved it out in words, and she described her journal pages that she was writing for therapy as shaky, but she has actually converted that information and the details of it into a book, which when we spoke, she had just sent off to her publisher. So she's trying to get her message and story out to an even wider audience.
That's really going to be very helpful, I think. You know, Tara lived with really, really troubling and in some ways kind of disabling symptoms for years before she was able to successfully find those roots to moving that pain and that trauma outside of herself. And it's just important, I think, for people to know that you don't get over something like this quickly. You don't get over depression really quickly. You don't get over PTSD quickly, and you're not failing and you're not doing anything wrong. It could be years that you're living with those feelings, those thoughts, those symptoms. It doesn't mean you're not getting better. It doesn't mean that things aren't going to be different someday, and you're not doing anything wrong, that it's taking so much time.
Yeah, I really liked how she said just kept taking the next step. She just kept doing the next thing, even when it was like, oh, that wasn't the step, capital D, capital S. But looking back, it was like, oh, I am in a little different place than I was. And, and any forward motion is forward motion.
Right. Even when you sometimes can't register that it is forward 100%. Motion until more time has passed. Yeah.
So thank you, Anita. And thank you very much, Tara. I hope that when people hear your story, that they understand that, wow, people survive all kinds of really terrifying things.
We truly hope that our podcast brings a little more understanding, helps you better articulate and reflect on your own experience with depression, or better understand how to support someone else who is struggling.
If this episode has been of comfort or value to you, know that there are hundreds of others like it in our archive, which you can easily find at our website, givingvoicetodepression.com. And remember, if you're struggling, speak up, even if it's hard. If someone else is struggling, take the time to listen.